A single moment of cruelty in an upscale restaurant spirals into an unexpected journey of reckoning for a powerful businesswoman and a young black waitress. As their lives take radically different paths, one toward success and the other toward downfall, they are drawn back together, forcing them both to confront the past. What Margaret doesn't know is that the woman she wronged holds the key to her unraveling, and karma has a way of making us face our deepest regrets. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The dim lighting of the restaurant cast a golden glow across the lavish dining room, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers that hung above. The quiet murmur of conversation blended with the delicate clink of silverware against fine china. At the center of it all sat Margaret, effortlessly poised, her designer dress fitting her form perfectly, every hair in place. Her companions, a group of equally polished women, laughed lightly at something she had said, their smiles as rehearsed as the lives they lived. Margaret was accustomed to this world, where status and wealth were the unspoken rules of engagement. Tonight was no different, save for the undercurrent of tension that hummed just beneath the surface of her carefully composed exterior. She had closed a major deal earlier in the week, solidifying her standing within her company, and yet, something gnawed at her. Perhaps it was the subtle shift in her daughter Clara's behavior lately, more challenging, more defiant, or maybe it was the mounting pressure at work, the whispers of a younger executive rising through the ranks. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a young waitress at their table. Eva. Margaret barely registered her approach, too absorbed in her own internal monologue. Eva, however, was immediately aware of Margaret. From the moment she had been assigned to serve their table, Eva knew what kind of customer she was dealing with, the kind that looked through you rather than at you. "Good evening, ladies," Eva began, her voice steady and professional despite the unease she felt under Margaret's cold gaze. "May I take your order?" Margaret glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning Eva with a look that conveyed both disinterest and judgment. "We've been waiting a while," she said, her tone cool but pointed. Eva's heart sank slightly, though her face remained neutral. She had been to their table only minutes before, but customers like Margaret rarely cared about the truth of a situation. They cared about how it fit their narrative. "I apologize for the wait," Eva said, her voice soft but firm. "Would you like to hear tonight's specials?" Margaret sighed, exasperated, as though Eva's very presence was an inconvenience. "No, I don't need the specials. I'll have the filet, medium rare. And make sure it's not overcooked this time." Her tone dripped with condescension, a subtle dig at some imagined past grievance. She tossed the menu onto the table, not bothering to hide her disdain. Eva nodded, scribbling the order onto her notepad, then moved on to the other women at the table. Each of them placed their orders with varying degrees of politeness, though none of them seemed to acknowledge the growing tension between their friend and the waitress. As Eva walked away to input the orders, she kept her face calm, but inside, her emotions churned. She had dealt with customers like Margaret before, women who saw her as invisible, or worse, as someone beneath them. Still, it never got easier. The indignities of the job, the subtle and not-so-subtle slights, were constant reminders of the social hierarchies that shaped her world. But Eva had learned to push through. She had to. This job was her livelihood, a stepping stone to something more. In the kitchen, Eva passed the order to the chef and leaned against the counter for a moment, gathering herself. She had been working here for over a year, but the steady pressure never let up. Every day was a battle between professionalism and the rising tide of frustration she felt in the face of people like Margaret. She thought of her family, her mother, who had sacrificed so much to raise her, her younger brother, still in school and full of promise. They depended on her. Margaret, meanwhile, resumed her conversation as if nothing had happened. To her, Eva's existence had already been dismissed, a mere footnote in the evening. She leaned back in her chair, her voice rising slightly as she regaled her friends with tales of her recent business triumphs. "You know," she said, taking a sip of her wine, "it's really astonishing how standards have fallen. Even in places like this, you'd think they'd at least hire people who know what they're doing." Her friends laughed, though a few glanced at each other uneasily. They knew Margaret could be harsh, but none of them were willing to challenge her. After all, in their world, it was better to go along than risk becoming the target of her sharp tongue. Time passed, and soon Eva returned with their orders, placing each dish carefully in front of the women. As she set Margaret's plate down, she felt the weight of the older woman's scrutiny. Margaret picked up her knife and fork, cutting into the steak. For a moment she said nothing, and Eva thought perhaps she had avoided further confrontation. But then Margaret looked up, her eyes cold and calculating. "This is medium well," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "I asked for medium rare. Honestly, how hard is it to get a simple order right?" Eva swallowed hard, feeling the eyes of the entire table on her. The steak was perfectly cooked, but she knew arguing would only make things worse. "I'll have the kitchen fix it for you right away," she said, her voice even despite the tension coiling inside her. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Forget it. I'm not waiting any longer." Eva nodded and walked away, her pulse pounding in her ears. The humiliation of the moment burned in her chest, but she kept moving. This was the reality of her life. Enduring the arrogance of people who would never see her as more than a servant, never understand the struggles she faced beyond the walls of the restaurant. As the night wore on, Margaret's mood lightened, the incident with Eva forgotten in the flurry of conversation and wine. But for Eva, the evening had left a mark. As she left the restaurant at the end of her shift, the cool night air stinging her skin, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the sting of Margaret's words, those she had heard too many times to count. It was the realization that no matter how hard she worked, how polite she was, there would always be people like Margaret who saw her as less. Margaret, of course, was oblivious to the ripple effect of her actions. She returned home, her mind already drifting toward the next day's agenda, unaware that this encounter, so trivial to her, would come back to confront her in ways she could never have imagined. For both women, the threads of their lives were about to cross again, and the consequences of that intersection would be more profound than either could foresee. Eva stood in the small kitchen of her apartment, the hum of the fridge the only sound breaking the early morning quiet. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as she poured herself a cup and sat down at the small, worn table by the window. Her eyes drifted to the stack of papers beside her. Her stories, her escape from the life she lived during the day. Writing was her refuge, the one place where her thoughts could be free, where she didn't have to navigate the judgment of others or suppress her feelings for the sake of keeping a job. But as she sat there, the events of the previous night replayed in her mind. Margaret's dismissive attitude, the cutting remarks, the casual cruelty wrapped in a veneer of politeness, it all weighed heavy on her. No matter how often it happened, it still stung. She was used to the microaggressions, the subtle ways people like Margaret reminded her that they saw her as less. But this time, it felt different, like something in her was reaching a breaking point. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the bitterness creeping into her thoughts. She had learned long ago that holding on to these feelings would only slow her down. Her mother had always told her, "Don't let them get to you, Eva. You're stronger than they'll ever know." And it was true. Eva had inherited her mother's strength, her quiet resilience. She had watched her mother work herself to the bone to give her and her younger brother a better life, never complaining, never showing weakness. And now it was Eva's turn to carry that torch. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from her brother, Marcus, reminding her that he needed help with his college application fees. Marcus was Eva's pride and joy, the one person who kept her grounded in moments of doubt. He was smart, driven, and had a bright future ahead of him. She had always promised herself she'd do whatever it took to help him succeed, even if it meant working long hours in a job that chipped away at her spirit. She quickly responded, promising to send the money later that week. Marcus had always been understanding of their situation, never pushing too hard, never asking for more than he knew she could give. But that didn't stop Eva from feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Every shift at the restaurant, every demeaning comment she endured, It was all for him. She wanted him to have the opportunities she had been denied. Her thoughts drifted back to her writing, the one dream she had allowed herself to hold on to. Late at night, after her shifts, she would sit at the small desk in her bedroom, pouring her heart into her stories. They were stories about people like her, people who faced invisible battles every day, navigating a world that wasn't built for them. In her writing, Eva gave voice to the experiences she couldn't express in her real life. It was her way of pushing back against the injustice she encountered, of reminding herself, and hopefully others, that her existence mattered. But the reality was that writing didn't pay the bills, at least not yet. And until it did, she was stuck in the grind of working jobs that made her feel small. She had submitted her stories to a few contests, even sent a manuscript to a small publishing house, but she hadn't heard anything back yet. Every day, she waited for that email, that phone call, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this could be her way out. But for now, she had to keep going. There were no other options. She glanced at the clock. It was almost time for her shift at the restaurant. With a sigh, Eva stood, gathering her things. The day stretched out before her like an endless road, and all she could do was keep walking. The restaurant was already bustling by the time Eva arrived. The familiar sounds of clattering dishes and the low hum of conversation filled the air. She tied her apron around her waist, trying to push the previous night's events out of her mind. Margaret was just another customer, she told herself. Another face in a long line of people who would come and go, each leaving their small mark, but none staying long enough to matter. As she moved through the dining room, greeting customers and taking orders, Eva found herself slipping into the rhythm of the day. It was easy to get lost in the routine, to let the repetition of service dull the sharper edges of her thoughts. But as she worked, she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances from some of the patrons, the way their eyes flickered over her, sizing her up, making assumptions about her life, her worth. Eva was used to it. She had learned to navigate the unspoken prejudices that shaped her interactions with others. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. She had seen it in school, in job interviews, even in her day-to-day errands. People treating her differently because of the color of her skin, because of the assumptions they made about her background. It was exhausting, constantly having to prove her worth in a world that seemed determined to undermine her at every turn. But she kept going, kept pushing forward, because that's what her mother had taught her to do. And deep down, Eva knew she was more than the labels people tried to place on her. She was more than just a waitress, more than just a black woman, in a world that often reduced her to those simple categories. As the day wore on, Eva found herself thinking about her future, about Marcus, about her writing, about what kind of life she wanted to build for herself. She dreamed of a day when she wouldn't have to rely on tips to get by, when she could focus on her passion without the constant pressure of financial survival. But that day still seemed so far away, a distant goal on the horizon. By the time her shift ended, Eva was exhausted. She changed out of her uniform and headed for the bus stop, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets, and as Eva sat on the bench waiting for her bus, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The sky above her was streaked with shades of pink and orange, a quiet reminder that there was beauty in the world, even in the midst of struggle. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Marcus. It was an email notification. Eva's heart raced as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. It was from the small publishing house she had submitted her manuscript 2 weeks ago. Her hands shook as she read the words. They loved her story. They wanted to publish it. For a moment, Eva couldn't move. She just sat there, staring at the screen, her mind struggling to process what this meant. All the long nights, all the hard work, the rejection, the doubt, it had all led to this moment. Her dream was within reach. As the bus pulled up, Eva boarded, her heart still pounding in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Eva's life was on the verge of transformation, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. But as her path began to rise, Margaret's was about to take a turn for the worse. In the next chapter, we will shift focus to Margaret, exploring the subtle cracks that are beginning to form in her seemingly perfect life. The invisible threads connecting these two women will start to tighten, drawing them closer to a moment of reckoning that neither of them could have predicted. Margaret stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, gazing out over the skyline. The view was impressive, expansive, powerful, a reflection of the life she had built for herself. She had worked hard to get here, clawing her way up the corporate ladder, making the right connections, saying the right things to the right people. And yet, despite everything, there was a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Lately, the cracks in her perfect life were beginning to show. Her success, once unquestionable, felt fragile, like a house built on shifting sand. The deal she had so confidently boasted about to her friends was unraveling, slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on. Investors were pulling back, partners were hesitating, and for the first time in her career, Margaret felt the uncomfortable sting of uncertainty. She turned away from the window and sat down at her sleek, modern desk, glancing at the stack of reports she had been avoiding all morning. Everything was in disarray. Her team, once loyal and efficient, seemed distracted, unmotivated. There were whispers, she could sense it, whispers that she was out of touch, that younger, hungrier colleagues were waiting in the wings, ready to take her place. Margaret had always prided herself on being in control, on staying ahead of the game, but now it felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through her emails, looking for something, anything, that would give her back that sense of control. Instead, she found a message from her daughter, Clara. "We need to talk." That was all it said, but Margaret could feel the tension in the words. Clara had been growing more distant in recent months, their conversations strained, often devolving into arguments. Clara had always been headstrong, but lately it seemed as though every discussion turned into a battle over ideals, over the world they both lived in but saw so differently. Margaret clicked her phone shut, dropping it onto her desk with a sigh. She didn't have the energy for another confrontation with her daughter. Not today. Clara had become increasingly involved in social justice causes, something Margaret had tried to support at first, but it wasn't long before their viewpoints clashed. "You don't understand, Mom," Clara had said the last time they argued. "You've lived your whole life in a bubble. You don't know what it's like for people who don't have your advantages." Margaret had bristled at that. She had worked for her success, sacrificed for it. She wasn't handed her position on a silver platter. She had earned it. But Clara seemed determined to paint her as some kind of privileged villain, blind to the struggles of others. Margaret had tried to brush it off, but the more Clara pushed, the more it stung. That conversation had been weeks ago, but it still echoed in Margaret's mind. Clara had stormed out, leaving behind a silence that had stretched between them ever since. Margaret looked down at her hands, realizing they were trembling. She clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. She didn't have time to fall apart. Not now. She had to fix the deal, had to get her team back in line, had to. A sharp knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was her assistant, a young woman named Lila, who had been with her for a few years now. "There's someone here to see you," Lila said, stepping into the room. "It's about the Westbrook project." Margaret's heart sank. She had been dreading this meeting. The Westbrook project was the deal that had started to go south, the one she had been trying to salvage for weeks. "Send them in," she said, standing and smoothing her jacket, trying to compose herself. As the representative from the investment firm walked in, Margaret put on her most professional face. She had always been good at this, convincing people, negotiating, winning them over. But as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that no amount of charm or skill would save this deal. The numbers didn't add up, the market was shifting, and no one was willing to take the risk. "I'm sorry, Margaret," the representative said after what felt like hours of back and forth. "We just don't think it's the right move for us at this time." Margaret nodded, her face a mask of calm, but inside, she was screaming. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for your time." As soon as the door closed behind them, Margaret sat down heavily in her chair, her composure crumbling. She had lost the deal, her reputation, her standing, it was all slipping away. She picked up her phone again, this time opening Clara's message. For a moment she considered replying, but what would she say? What could she say? Clara wouldn't understand. She was too idealistic, too wrapped up in her causes to see the real world. Margaret had worked her whole life to protect her from the harsh realities of life, but Clara seemed determined to tear down everything she had built. With a frustrated sigh, Margaret put the phone down. She needed to clear her head. She needed to think. The weight of the day, the failed deal, the strained relationship with her daughter, the whispers of her colleagues, pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt truly out of control. The following weekend, Margaret attended a charity gala. It was the kind of event she had always enjoyed. Glamorous, filled with important people, an opportunity to network and reassert her place in the social hierarchy. She dressed to perfection, her gown a shimmering cascade of silver that made her feel powerful, even if only for the night. But as she arrived at the event, Margaret couldn't shake the unease that had been building all week. The familiar faces, the polite smiles, the surface-level conversations, it all felt hollow. She mingled, as she always did, but her mind was elsewhere, her confidence wavering. It wasn't until she heard a name that her attention snapped back to the present. Eva Richards. Margaret turned, her heart skipping a beat. Eva. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. She listened as the event's host introduced the night's keynote speaker, Eva Richards, a young, up-and-coming author whose debut novel was making waves for its powerful exploration of social issues and personal resilience. As Eva took the stage, Margaret's stomach dropped. It was her, the waitress from the restaurant, the one she had humiliated without a second thought. Margaret watched in stunned silence as Eva spoke to the audience, her voice strong, her presence commanding. She spoke about the struggles she had faced, about overcoming adversity, about the importance of lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Every word hit Margaret like a hammer, each sentence a reminder of her own actions, her own arrogance. By the time Eva finished, the room was on its feet, applauding her. Margaret clapped along, her hands moving mechanically, but inside she was reeling. She had never thought about Eva after that night, never considered the impact of her words, her behavior. But now, seeing Eva standing there, proud and successful, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Regret. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself unable to enjoy the rest of the event. She kept thinking about Eva, about what Clara had said, about living in a bubble, about not understanding the struggles of others. For the first time, Margaret wondered if her daughter had been right all along. The cracks in Margaret's world were growing wider, and for the first time, she didn't know how to stop them from spreading. Eva sat at her desk, fingers lightly tapping the keys of her laptop as she stared at the screen. The words flowed easily now, each sentence carrying her deeper into the world she had created. A world that mirrored so much of her own struggles, yet was somehow distant. A place where her pain was transformed into something beautiful, something that resonated with others. Writing had always been a form of escape for her, but now it was something more. It was her platform, her voice. Her debut novel had taken the literary world by storm, a deeply personal exploration of race, identity, and resilience that had captured the attention of critics and readers alike. The book's success had come almost overnight, and now Eva found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never expected. As she typed the final words of the latest chapter in her second book, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. It was a sigh of relief, yes, but also of disbelief. How had she come so far in such a short time? It wasn't long ago that she had been serving tables, enduring the slights and subtle insults of customers who saw her as little more than the help. She thought back to the night with Margaret, to the sting of humiliation she had felt as the older woman had belittled her in front of her friends. That moment had stayed with her, not because it was unique, but because it was so common. That night had merely been a crystallization of all the quiet indignities she had experienced over the years. But now, things were different. Now, people listened when Eva spoke. Her words had power. She had power. Eva stood up from her desk and crossed the room to the window, looking out over the city skyline. The apartment was still new to her, a sleek, modern space with high ceilings and large windows that let in streams of natural light. It was a far cry from the cramped apartment she had shared with her brother Marcus, back when she was juggling waitressing shifts and trying to scrape together enough money to keep the lights on. Marcus. Eva smiled at the thought of him. He was doing well, better than well, in fact. He had gotten into the college of his dreams and was thriving in his studies, thanks in no small part to the financial help Eva could now offer. She had kept her promise to him, ensuring that he wouldn't have to struggle the way she had. The thought of his future, bright and full of possibilities, gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her publicist, reminding her about the charity gala she was scheduled to attend that evening. Eva's eyes widened slightly as she read the details. It was a major event, one of those high-profile gatherings that attracted the city's elite, the kind of people who had once looked down on her. The irony wasn't lost on her. For a moment she hesitated. The thought of being surrounded by those types of people again made her stomach twist. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't the one serving the table. She was the guest of honor, the keynote speaker. The realization filled her with a quiet sense of triumph. She had earned this. She had fought for this. And now, the very people who had dismissed her were the ones seeking her out, eager to hear her voice. Later that evening, Eva stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the strap of her evening gown. It was a simple, elegant dress, black with a flowing skirt that moved with her as she walked. She barely recognized herself in the reflection. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same person who had endured years of being overlooked, underestimated, and pushed aside. This woman was confident, self-assured, and unapologetically herself. She arrived at the gala with her publicist by her side, navigating the crowd with practiced ease. The event hall was grand, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and polished marble floors that gleamed under the soft lighting. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of champagne glasses. As Eva made her way through the crowd, she was greeted by a mix of familiar faces and new ones, all eager to meet the woman behind the book that had sparked such important conversations. Some of them spoke in hushed tones about the social issues her work addressed, while others praised her for her talent, her insight, her bravery. It was overwhelming at times, but Eva kept her composure, graciously accepting the compliments and engaging in conversations about the very topics she had spent years navigating in silence. And then, in the middle of the crowd, Eva saw her. Margaret. The sight of her was jarring, not because Eva hadn't expected to run into people like her at an event like this, but because she hadn't expected the flood of emotions that accompanied it. Margaret stood near the bar, her posture as poised as ever, but there was something different about her tonight. Her face, which had once radiated with confidence and superiority, now held a trace of something Eva couldn't quite place. Vulnerability? Uncertainty? For a moment their eyes met across the room, and Eva saw the flicker of recognition in Margaret's gaze. It was clear that Margaret remembered her. How could she not? But there was no flash of arrogance in her expression now. Instead, Margaret looked away, almost as though she couldn't bear to meet Eva's eyes. Eva's publicist interrupted her thoughts, tapping her on the shoulder to remind her that it was almost time for her to speak. She nodded, but as she walked toward the stage, her mind lingered on Margaret. This was a woman who had once reduced her to nothing more than an inconvenience, but now Eva was the one with the platform, the voice, the power. The applause was deafening as Eva stepped onto the stage. She took a moment to collect herself, looking out over the sea of faces before her. This was her moment, a chance to tell her story, to speak her truth. As she began, her voice was steady, strong, filled with the conviction that had carried her through so many years of struggle. "I stand here tonight," she said, her words echoing through the hall, "not because I was given opportunities, but because I fought for them. I fought for my voice to be heard in a world that often tries to silence people like me." She spoke about her experiences, about the countless moments of discrimination and dismissal that had shaped her journey. She spoke about the power of resilience, about rising above the limitations others tried to place on her. And she spoke about the importance of empathy, of seeing people not for the color of their skin or their socioeconomic status, but for who they truly are. As Eva's speech came to a close, the applause was even louder than before. But in the midst of the applause, Eva's eyes found Margaret's again. This time, Margaret didn't look away. She held Eva's gaze, her expression unreadable, but there was no denying the shift between them. Eva no longer felt small in Margaret's presence. If anything, it was Margaret who seemed diminished, her confidence eroded by the weight of her own past actions. After the speech, as the crowd began to disperse, Eva found herself standing near the exit, talking to a few of the event organizers. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Margaret approaching. Eva turned, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The moment she had never imagined, but now couldn't avoid. Margaret stopped in front of her, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. Margaret started, her voice faltering. I just wanted to say, your speech was moving. Eva studied her, waiting for the words that were clearly struggling to find their way out. I remember you, Margaret continued, her voice quieter now. From the restaurant. What I did, the way I treated you, it wasn't right. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything they carried. Eva didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure what to say. Part of her had wanted this moment for so long, to hear those words, to have Margaret acknowledge the pain she had caused. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel like the victory she had imagined. I appreciate the apology, Eva said finally, her voice measured. But an apology doesn't erase what happened. Margaret nodded, her face pale. I know it doesn't. For a moment they stood there, two women whose lives had collided in ways neither of them had anticipated. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still unwritten. As Margaret turned to walk away, Eva felt a strange sense of closure. She hadn't forgiven Margaret, not fully. But she no longer needed Margaret's validation to feel whole. She had found her own voice, and that was enough. Margaret sat in the back seat of her car, staring blankly out the window as the city lights blurred by. The night felt strangely surreal, as though she had stepped out of her life and into someone else's. Eva's voice still echoed in her mind, clear, strong, filled with a quiet power that had made Margaret feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The apology she had given Eva felt inadequate, hollow even, and she knew it. Margaret had spent her life wielding her influence like a weapon, bending situations and people to her will, without ever stopping to think about the consequences. For her, interactions like the one she'd had with Eva at the restaurant were just part of the fabric of her existence. It wasn't personal, she had told herself. It was just business. It was just the way the world worked. But now, sitting alone in the car, the weight of those casual cruelties pressed down on her like a leaden cloak. The car pulled up to the driveway of her grand home, and Margaret hesitated before stepping out. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt cold, empty. The lights were on inside, but they didn't offer the warmth she needed. Her husband was away on a business trip, and Clara had barely spoken to her in weeks. The last time they had talked, it had ended in another argument. This time about the gala, about the causes Clara championed, and Margaret's refusal to see the world through her daughter's eyes. Margaret made her way inside, her heels clicking on the polished marble floors. She paused at the bottom of the grand staircase, looking up at the darkened hallway that led to Clara's room. A part of her wanted to climb those stairs, knock on Clara's door and try again. Try to explain, try to apologize, not just for their recent fights, but for everything. For the years of distance, the emotional walls she had built between them. But another part of her, the part that had always been so guarded, so unwilling to show vulnerability, held her back. Instead, Margaret sank onto the plush couch in the living room, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She stared at the screen, at the long list of unread messages and missed calls from colleagues and clients, all demanding her attention. She scrolled through them absent-mindedly, but nothing registered. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the evening, the moment when she had looked into Eva's eyes and seen something she hadn't expected. Understanding. Eva hadn't needed Margaret's apology. That much had been clear. Eva had risen above the situation, above Margaret's words, and found her own strength. And it was that realization, the knowledge that she, Margaret, no longer had the power to affect Eva, that had shaken her to her core. For so long, Margaret had believed that power was something you imposed on others, something you wielded to maintain control. But now she understood that real power didn't come from dominance or wealth. It came from within, from a sense of self that couldn't be shaken by the opinions or actions of others. Margaret tossed the phone onto the coffee table, her heart heavy. She hadn't just lost a business deal that week. She had lost something far more personal, her sense of identity, the image she had built of herself as a strong, invincible woman who always came out on top. She leaned back, closing her eyes. The silence of the house felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the noise of the world she had once thrived in. For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fix things. She didn't know how to move forward. Meanwhile, across the city, Eva sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in front of her. She had returned from the gala a few hours ago, but sleep had eluded her. Her thoughts kept circling back to her encounter with Margaret. The apology. The look in Margaret's eyes. Eva had always imagined that if she ever saw Margaret again, she would feel triumphant, vindicated. She had spent so many nights replaying that moment in the restaurant, thinking of all the things she could have said, all the ways she could have stood up for herself. But now that the moment had come and gone, it didn't feel like a victory. Eva wasn't the same person she had been that night in the restaurant. She had grown, not just in terms of her career, but in her sense of self. The things Margaret had said to her back then would have crushed her once, but now they were just words. Eva had learned that people like Margaret didn't define her. She defined herself. Still, Eva couldn't shake the image of Margaret's face as she apologized. There had been genuine regret there, a rawness that surprised her. For a moment, Eva had almost felt sorry for Margaret, for the weight of guilt that seemed to press down on her shoulders. But she knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given so easily. It wasn't about holding on to anger. Eva wasn't angry anymore. She had moved past that. But forgiveness, real forgiveness, took time. And it had to be earned. Eva took a sip of her tea, her thoughts drifting to the future. The success of her book had opened doors she had never thought possible. There were talks of a second book, of speaking engagements, even of adapting her story for film. But more than the accolades, what mattered to Eva was the impact her words were having on people. The letters she received from readers. Young black women, people of color, those who had faced discrimination and prejudice in all its forms, meant more to her than any award. Her story had resonated with them, had given them a sense of hope, a reminder that they were not alone. She thought about Marcus, about how proud he had been when he had attended her first book signing. "You did it, Eva," he had said, his voice filled with awe. "You're changing the world." Eva smiled at the memory. Maybe she wasn't changing the whole world, but she was changing her corner of it, and that was enough. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Clara, Margaret's daughter. "Can we meet?" "I'd love to talk." Eva stared at the message for a long moment, her mind spinning. She had met Clara only briefly at the gala, but something about the young woman had struck her. Clara had seemed different from her mother, more aware, more thoughtful, and now she was reaching out. Eva typed a quick response, agreeing to meet the following week. As she set her phone down, she felt a strange sense of anticipation. Clara was a link to Margaret, yes, but Eva sensed that this meeting would be about more than that. It was about building bridges, about understanding the complexities of people and relationships. The following week, Eva and Clara sat across from each other in a small cafe, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Clara was nervous, fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater as she spoke. "I'm really sorry about what happened between you and my mom," she began, her voice hesitant. "She's complicated." Eva nodded, listening carefully. She could see the tension in Clara's posture, the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. Clara sighed. "I've been trying to get her to see things differently, to understand how the world works for people who aren't like her, but she's always been so stubborn, so set in her ways. Eva leaned forward, her expression soft but firm. "People like your mother don't change overnight," she said gently. "But sometimes it takes a moment of reckoning to make them see the truth." Clara looked down, her voice small. "I think that moment is coming for her. I just don't know if she's ready for it." Eva reached across the table, placing her hand over Clara's. "People can surprise you," she said. "Your mom, she has a lot to work through, but she's started. That's something." Clara smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you. I guess I just needed to hear that." As they sat together, Eva realized something important. The story wasn't just about her and Margaret. It was about the people around them, the ripple effects of their actions, the way one person's growth could inspire change in another. In the days that followed, Margaret began to take small steps toward understanding herself. She started by reaching out to Clara, apologizing for the distance she had created between them. It wasn't easy, but it was a beginning. She sought out conversations with people she had once ignored, listening to stories she had never bothered to hear before. Margaret didn't expect forgiveness, least of all from Eva, but she knew that if she was ever going to make things right, she had to start with herself. And as Eva continued to rise in her career, she did so with the knowledge that she had reclaimed her story, her power. She had moved beyond the hurt, beyond the need for validation from people like Margaret. Now she was writing a new chapter, one filled with purpose, resilience, and hope. In the end, both women had changed, though in different ways. For Eva, the journey had been about rising above the limitations others had placed on her. For Margaret, it had been about confronting the limitations within herself. Neither journey was easy, but both were necessary. As the years passed, their paths crossed from time to time, not as enemies but as two women who had once been tangled in a web of prejudice and misunderstanding, but had found their way out, each in her own time. And in that, there was something like peace. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.